Nearly 40 years ago, a passing motorist on a rural stretch of highway south of Denver made a grim discovery: the body of a woman, sexually assaulted and strangled, left along the roadside near Sedalia, Colorado. Her name was Rhonda Marie Fisher. She was 30 years old, and for decades, no one knew who killed her.
She was a daughter, a sister, a cousin, and a niece. And her family members have waited nearly 4 decades for answers.
The break didn't come from a new witness or a deathbed confession. It came from 2 paper bags that had sat untouched in an evidence room since 1987. Bags the coroner had slipped over Rhonda's hands at the scene, standard practice to protect whatever trace evidence might be clinging to her skin. Nobody had ever tested them for DNA. When crime lab scientists finally ran those bags for DNA, they got a hit: skin cells belonging to Vincent Groves, a man already dead. He died in Colorado's prison system back in 1996. Before we get into this one, if you're new here, this is the Black Docket, where we dig into the cases that took decades to crack. If stories like Rhonda's matter to you, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. This case involves details of sexual assault and homicide. Viewer discretion is advised. Every detail in this video comes from official statements, sheriff's office releases, and verified news reporting. Nothing here is speculation presented as fact.
40 years is a long time for a murder to stay silent. But in this case, the silence did not mean the truth was gone. It meant the evidence was waiting. For decades, investigators had one question they could not answer: who killed this woman in 1987, and why did it take so long for the case to finally break open? Then, after years of dead ends, preserved evidence and modern DNA testing gave detectives the name they had been missing all along. This is the story of a cold case that refused to stay cold. The victim was Rhonda Marie Fisher, a woman whose life was cut short in 1987. Public reporting describes a brutal murder that left her family and investigators with grief, questions, and no clear path forward. For years, the case sat in the dark, the kind of case that can disappear into storage unless someone keeps asking the right questions. And that is the first thing to understand about cold cases. They do not become less real just because time passes. A body is found, evidence is collected, detectives work the leads they have, witnesses forget, move away, or die. Technology changes, and somewhere in a file room, a small piece of evidence waits for a future investigators could not yet imagine. That future arrived here through DNA. Before we get to the breakthrough, we need to understand the shape of the original case. In 1987, law enforcement responded to Rhonda Fisher's murder and began building the case from the ground up. The early investigation would have followed the standard path: scene processing, witness interviews, suspect checks, timeline reconstruction, and evidence preservation. At the time, the science that now drives so many cold case breakthroughs simply was not available. There was no modern forensic genetic genealogy. There was no expectation that a decades-old sample could be re-examined and compared against large DNA databases. There was just the evidence sealed and waiting, and the hope that one day someone would be able to do more with it. That is what makes this kind of case so powerful. The truth is often not lost. It is just inaccessible until the tools catch up. Years passed. Then more years passed. The case remained open, but the trail remained cold. Like so many cases from that era, there were likely names considered, leads pursued, and suspicions that never hardened into an arrest. But none of it was enough. Then the science changed. Modern DNA testing gave investigators the chance to return to evidence collected long ago and ask a new question: does this sample still contain something usable? In this case, that question mattered. Authorities later said the murder had been solved through evidence re-examination and advanced DNA analysis. That means investigators did not simply rediscover the case file. They revisited the physical evidence itself, looking for a biological profile that could be compared against known databases, or linked through newer investigative methods. This is where cold case work becomes both scientific and almost architectural. First, analysts identify what evidence still exists. Then, they test whether enough biological material remains for a usable profile. If it does, that profile can be compared against DNA databases or used in a broader investigative process. In some cases, it produces a direct hit. In others, it points to a family line, a relative, or a known offender with a pattern of violence. Either way, the case begins to move again. And once that movement starts, the timeline changes. The question is no longer whether the case can be solved. The question becomes whether the evidence will be strong enough to name the person responsible. That was the turning point here. After nearly 4 decades, the re-examination of evidence in Rhonda Fisher's case led investigators to a suspect. Public reporting indicates that the breakthrough came from advanced DNA analysis, the kind of technology that can pull a name from evidence that once seemed too old to speak. And when that happens, a cold case stops being a historical mystery and becomes a live investigative outcome. That does not erase the years that came before. It does not undo the pain of waiting, but it does something else that matters just as much. It returns agency to the victim's story. For years, Rhonda Fisher was defined by the fact that her case remained unsolved. Once the DNA evidence identified a suspect, her case became defined by accountability. That is the emotional center of the script. Not the crime alone, not the science alone, but the long delay between violence and truth. Cases like this also remind viewers why evidence preservation matters so much. A sample that seems minor in the moment can become decisive decades later. A trace item, a swab, a biological residue, or a retained piece of clothing can outlive the original investigation and speak when people cannot. That is why detectives and labs keep cold cases alive. Not because every case will be solved, but because some of them will. And when they are, the result can be extraordinary. In this story, the breakthrough did not arrive through a confession, a dramatic new witness, or a lucky tip. It arrived through science. That makes it less cinematic in the usual sense, but more convincing in the only sense that matters. Evidence was tested. A profile emerged. Investigators followed it, and after decades of uncertainty, the case finally had a direction. That is the kind of ending families wait for. Not an ending that erases loss, not an ending that turns back time, just one that gives a name to the violence and closes the space where doubt used to live. If there is a larger lesson in this case, it is that justice can be delayed without being denied forever. DNA has changed what investigators can do with old evidence, and cold cases like this prove that a file sitting untouched for years may still hold the answer. For Rhonda Fisher's family, the passage of time was never just time, it was grief stretched across decades. And now, at least, that grief has a clearer shape. The evidence was re-examined. The DNA spoke. The case was solved. And after nearly 40 years, the question that haunted the file finally had an answer. Rhonda Fisher did not disappear into the past. Her case came back into the light. And because it did, the truth now stands where silence used to be.